So welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I am also a fiction writer and novelist, and that's why I get the honor of having this chat today. So we're here today to talk about Meet Us by the Roaring Sea with our guest author, Akil Kumarasamy. And I'm so excited to talk about this book. It's so excellent, and I just can't wait to learn more about how this book came into being, because I have so many questions and so many thoughts and so much interest. So Akil, thank you so much for joining us. And if you have a copy of your book handy, could I convince you to read just a short excerpt so our guests get a taste of what we'll be talking about?
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to the Writers Center. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you everyone for coming, and everyone around the world from Hawaii to Korea. Amazing. So I'm just going to read a small excerpt in the beginning, just like the opening passage. A mother is a slippery thing. She brings you into the world and then departs. All your mother has left for you are these rough cut memories that both sting and shimmer when held too closely. In one, she sits next to you and asks you to be grateful that she is dead. You clench your teeth and she tells you to spit out your anger. It will lessen the pain, she says, embracing what hurts. You don't look into her eyes because they are entrances to all these unsaid feelings, regret and longing, and you are afraid of how her face might crease into pity for her weak, sad daughter. Aya, do you know which came first, mother or egg? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. So, in your own words, who the heck are you?
Oh man, it feels like when you ask that question, it also feels kind of existential.
If you want to go existential, that would be great. So please go that direction.
I guess writing is one thing that I do, and I guess this is my second book, which is my debut novel, and my first book was an interlinked short story collection. But I also do other things, like I do improv comedy and other things. But yeah, I guess a writer who mostly fiction, that writes fiction. Yeah.
Great. So our first question that we usually ask is also the one that authors most often hate. So let's get out of the way. And what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? Or in other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before that maybe you can claim a chance to talk about now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I feel like I guess I would love to talk about a little bit about the tone of the book, kind of like the humor. I think sometimes when you are writing about stuff or writing about material that might be considered like heavy, for example, grief or death or even war, having it brush up against something else like humor kind of intensifies the feeling of both things, and then trying to modulate the tone of the book. That was really interesting for me. And also during the pandemic, I actually I moved back to New Jersey, where I'm from, because I got a job at Rutgers, and I was living with my mom, and she ended up reading the book while I was writing it, and she ended up kind of collaborating with me in some strange way. So those like the unexpected pandemic collaborations that happened.
That's great. On the humor aspect, is humor something you really reach for intentionally, or is it something that just sort of, is that you said you did improv, so I wonder, is that just something that comes out naturally? I asked as a writer, sometimes someone will say, oh, that was funny. I'm like, yeah, I guess so. I wasn't like, I didn't ever felt like I was trying to make a joke. I just maybe there's a certain wryness to my thinking versus overt humor.
Yeah, I think it's just because like reality is sometimes just very absurd. So it just feels kind of like naturally emerges, like, some like kind of like a dark humor. So it doesn't feel like I was intentionally trying to be funny, but it just I think it's just like comedy or just humor is just how we cope and how we kind of make sense of the world too, and understand it. So I think it just blends very naturally with material that's even like that might seem like dark or heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Well, my first craft question is sort of the big obvious craft question, is that this book has two different points of view, and they're the two rarest, I would say, which is it starts in second person with you. You is who is being addressed in the first section, And then there's the text within a text, which is the novel that the protagonist is translating, and that's in the first person plural. So we get you up against we.
Yeah.
Before I get specific questions though, how did this come about?
Yeah, as many people say, like these are like the two unusual points of views to have, and like also together is probably even stranger. The first point of view that came to me was actually the collective we, and I first wrote the inner manuscript, and that collective kind of voice. I was really trying to kind of tap into some sort of collective consciousness. So that emerged. And as I was writing the book, I became much more about this idea of kind of radical compassion and how do we care about people across borders, across countries, across like identities. And then the you is a strange tense because the you is sort of like the in-between tense between first person and third person. It feels intimate, but there's some distance. And I found that the second person really spoke to the kind of experience of grief, the kind of out of body experience of navigating grief, and also someone who is trying to find themselves. So I kind of needed that kind of intimate and sort of in between quality. So the you, and also the you is also involves the reader. It's, it calls the reader, and it's like you're involved in the story. So I kind of like that interactive aspect of the you. So it sort of naturally emerged, and I guess I wasn't afraid of just kind of leaning into those spaces because it felt really particular for the book and the structure of it.
So did it feel at all? So I might be scared to do that.
Yeah.
One or the other. Okay, I can roll there.
Yeah.
My next story that's coming out somewhere has a we. I've been in the first person plural lately. But doing both, did it feel bold to you as you were doing it, or did it just not even cross your mind that this was a bold decision?
Yeah, I guess it didn't feel a bold decision, but I can understand why it might feel like a bold decision. But it feels like, as writers, like we only have so much like in our palette. Like we could play around with point of view, we could play around with tense, we could play around with time or structure. So it just felt like I was trying to utilize what I had to create some sort of experience for the reader. Point of view was something I could play around with. So just like, painterly being like, this is what I have, and trying to manipulate it in a way to create a sort of effect. Yeah.
I mean, and I want to say too that it never feels while reading this book that it was a decision, that it was like some arbitrary, I'm going to do this kind of thing. So it flows so naturally. And it was just like, I think it was, I don't even think I caught the we until I was a little ways in, like, wait a minute, we're suddenly in a we after being in a you. And so it was like, it is very organic, it's very natural. So it's in no way meant to you, but also to everyone here, this is a very organic feeling thing. So it's really even more impressive that these two, something that could be just discussing it, just called bold, is like, no, it just feels like this is what the story should be. So that's really great. So you mentioned a couple things. Is there anything else that these perspectives allow you to do that an I or a third person omniscient or limited omniscient narrator wouldn't let you do?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, like a lot of this book is also kind of people trying to kind of like kind of escape their egos or trying to care about like the suffering of others. So like the first person felt so close to the kind of like the ego to the self, and he or she had he or she didn't seem as interactive. Like when you use the we, when you say you, it could be the reader as well. The reader is kind of it's kind of pointed to in the reading process. So like I think I wanted like the book to feel sort of interactive, like as if like it's asking something of the reader as well. And like the we and like the you and the we do different things. Like the we feels like it's sort of like it feels kind of safe in some ways. It's like we're in a collective, we're safe in this space, while the you feels a bit kind of lonely. You're also in this sort of weird like liminal space between first and third, and you're sort of like out of your body, and it feels a bit like you're kind of suspended and you're floating. So I think that kind of aspect of the book, I think that came through just the point of view. So I was trying to kind of capture that essence.
I love the idea of you as lonely and liminal. That's such a great way for almost every second person story I read. There is that quality of, it has the opposite effect of pulling you in a way. It actually makes you experience something that isn't yours, but yeah, I've wrote that note down. I'm going to be pondering that for the next few days. I'll credit you when I write the craft essay. So were there any issues, though, in writing these points of view that were particularly difficult or unique to writing in these points of view versus first person or third person?
Yeah, because like, for example, in like first person plural, you don't have like an individual character you're following. So you're kind of speaking in this like grander collective mythic voice. Trying to make sure that the reader continue to feel interested in like the sort of like amalgam voice, because usually we want to follow a certain character. And the we in the book there, I do also mention like other characters with the we, but the we stays pretty much consistent in some ways. But just like how do you have a story that you continue to care about what is happening to this kind of amalgam, and how do you still kind of create some sort of distinctions in that we. And for the you was also, the you, as you said, I mentioned, like kind of a liminal space. So how do you also, and like the character it's kind of out of body and sort of like maybe disengaged in some ways. So how do you kind of keep that voice? And it's also someone who might not be in touch with their feelings as much. Like this you could be the sort of weird space. So how do you have this character feel invested or like seem like they are also very present and also like fully a character too? Because the you kind of seems also like disembodied. So how do you make that you feel like a character as well? So yeah, I think it's just like when you have these kind of amalgam point of views, like you and we, just how to feel a sense of a person, but also make it feel larger than a person.
I mean, it's true, because that you definitely get a sense of the character of the protagonist in the you sections. You don't feel like it's not like a choose your own adventure where you're living out the thing in the stead of the main character. You definitely get a sense of that character. Anyway, more of the essay coming here in the near future. Just a quick reminder to everyone, please, if you have a question, type it in the chat window. I will be happy to ask your question. So please start sending them our way. So my next topic was just something I noticed in the book that I found really interesting and really enjoyed, was the small personal stuff. Within the first few pages and then throughout the book, there are references to jazz, space, physics, and probably a few other things that repeat that I'm not remembering at the moment. Are these personal interests in general of yours?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you like pointed that, like those little, like, like little tidbits out. Yeah, they're both like kind of personal interests. Like I did like while I was writing the book, I would often visit the jazz archives in Newark, and also, yeah, interested in like, physics and space. But also like for the book, it was also like three kind of different perspectives also to kind of see the world, and also thinking about physics, thinking about jazz, also gave different kind of interpretations of the world, and it kind of also gave the book a little bit of a surreal, suspended feel that I was trying to capture. So it was both like to create this sort of atmosphere in the book, and also a different lens to kind of read the world. Yeah.
So random question, what is one of your favorite jazz albums?
Oh my God, that's hard. That's hard.
I said one. I didn't say favorite. Just a favorite jazz album. There's no prep on this one. I'm so sorry.
No. I can't pick, but I did mention Alice Coltrane in this book, but I said, yeah, so I'll just, I can't pick the album though, but
that's
yeah,
fine. We'll go with Alice. And it's interesting. I maybe noted the kind of physics asides, because I think that's also feels to me, and you can just correct me if I'm wrong, this is at least what I do, and I sort of interpret the world through physics sometimes, like the basic, that's one of my interpretive lenses. You used the word lens a minute ago, I think.
Yeah.
So like that, my basic interpretation comes through there. So that stuff sneaks into my writing all the time, just because that's when I'm thinking about existence. It is usually at the, the quark level, not the, not the leaf on the tree level. So is that something you experience too?
Yeah, I think, I'm thinking of like on the quark, the energy level versus the solid level, or I'm thinking, I'm not necessarily thinking the Newtonian level, but yeah, so I think it was like a lens to like personal lens to see the world, and also it became a lens for the book, how they were kind of reading the world and navigating it.
Great. So the next text thing or craft thing I want to go is the text within the text. So within the novel, there's the protagonist is translating a book, and the translated book appears between the other chapters. And I always love anytime, oh, I don't say anytime, I often love when a novel has alternating sections, and the text within the text is obviously this great alternation between the near future and fairly recent past. So how did you mentioned you wrote the text within the text first. How did that originate? And then was the format always going to be that embedded within this larger format?
Yeah, actually, no. So like when I first wrote, I just wrote the text within the text, not knowing it was a text within the text. And I was really just following the voice. So I was just following this I just started writing this this collective first person plural. And it just, that voice just started gaining power for me. So kind of just writing what I didn't really know what this book was going to be. So just kind of writing into known spaces, meaning like I knew this had energy. So just writing into the space of this world where these group of girls were living at the edge of a war and during a drought, and kind of coming up with this new idea of radical compassion. So I was just writing into that space. And then as I was doing different things, as I mentioned, like the Jazz Archives, I went to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And like other things just kind of flowed into the book from just my own journey. So I started with that. And then this outer storyline came about, of this kind of future storyline that takes place in the near future in New York City. And someone is translating this text. So it sort of evolved. So most of the book was like constant discovery, and just kind of being open to where this book took me and just following a kind of intuition with it.
So besides the obvious connection that the text within the text is essentially written by the protagonist, how do they relate? And maybe even a better question is, how do they interact with each other? How do they, they definitely feel like a cohesive whole, but not in, I'd have to go in and felt like I'd dive and really look for like those, how the tentacles are reaching back and forth between them. How do you think, or how did you intend for them to interact?
Yeah, like it's a bit of a strange kind of like both storylines are kind of working on different timelines and also geographies. Someone in the future is translating from New York City a manuscript that takes place in a different part of the world and a different time period. And part of this was also thinking about even physics entanglement and thinking about these things of two things affecting each other, or in kind of like seemingly unexpected ways in different places. And in both the manuscript and the outer world, we have like characters who are kind of who are experiencing like either grief or struggling through something like a drought, and they're kind of forced to kind of figure out ways to kind of care about people beyond their circumstances. So kind of how do you care about others when you yourself are going through so much pain, so much grief. So kind of having both are kind of pushed to kind of forced to kind of care for others, kind of beyond and kind of thinking beyond themselves. So in that aspect, kind of thinking about how this idea of going beyond yourself and this idea of compassion, how would it look in the future? How does it look in this space? And so that's one connection. And also I think thinking about how kind of just also just they're kind of thinking about how kind of women are kind of navigating different spaces. And for example, in the text, they're at the edge of a war, but they're still involved with the war. And the main character, the translator, she is working on an AI project that might have some significant consequences, and she kind of is forced to kind of see her role in something larger. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to have that kind of like strange entanglement effect in the text as well. Yeah,
that's great. So one question for me on this type of thing though is about revision, because how do the two? So from your first draft until the finished book, how did you revise the sections in relation to each other? Did they get more connections? They move a little further apart? How did that work? Did some things get closer? Some things move further apart? were there really obvious connections sort of hammered in there, and then you said that's too obvious and you moved them, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think I was just kind of trying to when I broke the sections of each of the inner texts, trying to see how would the inner text affect what's happening in the outside world, and trying to make sure that that kind of mirrors each other in both texts, in the inner text and also in the outside world. Television is really important, TVs. So I was kind of seeing like what was the echo effect of both sections, and that was something that was something a little tricky to do as I was working through the manuscript. Because I always wanted to feel a kind of like a kaleidoscope, like each one was feeding into each other and changing how you saw each of the sections. And also revising also a lot of my, so the book in some ways, this was not the first draft of the book looked different, but the essence was the same. And I think each revision, I was just trying to drastically change the kind of maybe perhaps like even thinking the tone of the book. The manuscript inside the book stayed the same mostly. It was just kind of getting the tone of the outer world, because sometimes when you have like a science fiction book, something that takes place in the near future, you can start feeling really heavy-handed, or kind of you're on a soapbox talking about what's happening in the world, everything is awful. So how to kind of just like modulate that tone.
Yeah, great. So Emily is reminding everyone in the chat window, please to post your questions there, and we will ask your questions if you ask them to us. So another thing that, especially in the two big sections aside, within especially the protagonist sections, the non-text within the text sections, there's lots of pieces. There's lots of stuff going on. And I say that with adoration because it's navigated so well. But there's all these little moving parts. There's a reality show called Soldier's Diaries that they watch and gets even closer than watching. There's an art exhibition. There's the protagonist's job. There's the mother's death and clutter. There's so many things that pop in pretty quick succession. How do you take all those elements and deftly navigate between them? What makes them cohesive is sort of the question.
Yeah, that was like that was probably the difficult part. And also I think, you mentioned there's like a lot of components, and I think our instinct would probably be to just remove some of those components and make it more streamlined. But I felt that they were deeply connected, and part of the process of the revision process, at first when I was revising, I was a bit overwhelmed by all the different plot points that I sometimes would just like think in my head, oh, each section I should at least go touch on 3 of them. And I was like, name 3, name 4 here, name 3. And then when I did that, it was just functioning on a very much on the plot level, and it did not really feel like it was getting into the subtext of what was happening. So I did a version where I had just I made sure to just touch at least on like 2 points, 3 points, just trying to get at all different plot points. But then after I did that version, I had to go back and kind of see what was happening on the kind of subtext level, and kind of just start writing from that level, and not necessarily worrying about like if every plot point was touched, and trying to just trying to also I knew which characters are involved in certain plot points, and trying to use that as a kind of reminder and a kind of emotional thread. So there was different plot lines to connect to certain characters. So I knew that, and just sort of making sure I was functioning on that deeper level, because it was really easy just to be like, you have to mention this because the reader will forget, or that, as just trying to, just kind of get under the surface a bit more.
I mean, one of my favorite things I think this novel does beautifully is when you have all those different things abutting and juxtaposing, that it's the seams where the interesting subtext and the interesting meanings are emerging. It's when they butt up against each other unexpectedly, like, oh, I just jumped here. And then I guess my next question then is, how similar to the interactions between the two larger sections, how do the smaller moments relate to each other, and why do you think one ends up next to another one? Is it recognizing the subtext between them?
Yeah, I think that how you said it's like so beautiful, Zach. Just like, you know, just like this, it's like the seams that you creates meanings. And like, it's just like, I think I was constantly thinking of like the, you know, juxtaposition creates meaning. And I feel like, you know, if you watch film, that might be like a really helpful model, because sometimes like in a film, you jump around different scenes, but you kind of this piece, like this, how a scene ends and how another scene opens, it kind of just creates that sort of tension and meaning in that space. So I was kind of functioning on that, like thinking about that, thinking about, I know, the book is sort of a bit like vignettes. So how do I jump from one scene to another? So I was thinking about kind of like where I'm leaving the reader and what kind of image I want to start with. So kind of using the juxtaposition to create meaning. Someone told me that the book kind of reminded them of kind of having like there's multiple characters kind of orbiting each other, and they kind of sometimes collide, sometimes like move around. And that's sort of has some sort of suspended feel, the book, because it doesn't really feel like something happened. It doesn't feel like, you know, this hits that and that, you know, it doesn't feel like a domino effect. But it feels like more like these characters kind of like they're all circling each other sometimes, and they're getting into each other's orbits, and they're kind of, and that has some sort of like a friction or effect. Yeah.
I want to come back to that because I had some questions I think that relate, but we have a question in the chat,
Yeah.
and it's actually a question that I really like to ask when you have an author who published stories first and then a novel second. And I didn't have it on my list, so I'm very glad that someone else asked it, which is, how was your writing process different for your short story book, your first book, compared to the novel?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yeah, it felt, you know, for like a short story collection, it felt like for each story you were kind of, you know, you had to create something from scratch. Like you had to create like a whole new structure, a whole new kind of world for that short story. So a little bit each time you were climbing from the bottom of the barrel, trying to figure out like how to make this short story work. While for the novel, it felt like once I found the structure, I just had to keep going and like moving with that one structure. So I had that kind of you could kind of just like keep going, the snowball effect almost. You just keep moving in with the structure, but you first had to figure out the structure. I do think because I wrote a short story collection, I used the first person plural, I used the second person, I experimented a lot with my short story collection. So I felt like, I think when I came to my novel, I think I felt much more like confident in just like experimenting with things and just like doing an unusual structure. I think that's partly because of having done, you know, short stories. And, you know, if you write 10 short stories, it feels almost like you wrote like 10 books almost. Yeah.
Did you have a completed story collection then start the novel, or was there any overlap? Was this novel in progress at all during the story writing?
Yeah, there was overlap. So I did have like maybe 15 pages of this, like, or 20 pages of the novel. Yeah, when I was like finishing up this book. Yeah. Okay.
So you sort of knew where you're going after you finished the first thing.
Yeah, I knew where I was going at the same time. This book, I had no idea what this book was doing. So it was, a lot of it was just, I had some idea that, like, you know, this first person plural voice was interesting, but that was about it. So I wasn't too sure what it would become. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So actually going to jump ahead. We mentioned, you know, the story doesn't have like the dominoes knocking over other dominoes kind of plot thing going on. And I love the way you said it's sort of things orbiting each other. And again, I'm getting back to quantum physics and thinking about all the motion of particles there. So especially in the non-translation sections, I don't see scene building in the story arc kind of sense, you know, that I don't see each chapter having that, you know, traditional shape or whatever shape you want to do there. However, there's amazing forward motion to me. I would call it a page turner. I kept wanting to keep going forward and was enthralled. So what makes something a story for you? What makes it, if it's not a traditional recognizable, what they teach you in a writing workshop shape, what is it?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think we all see like Freytag's pyramid, and that's like that we have like that linear chronological motion. And I think for like, if like I had like a model, it would be something like, you know, it would be like maybe a circle, and then like you have like the present, and maybe it's moving constantly to the past and the future. So I think, for me, it's like a story that is a story is something that both it's like it's something that's intriguing that makes you kind of continue, and also like if the perspective is interesting, you'll follow it kind of no matter what. And for me, the story was so much. It's both about a character, both reckoning with the past, but at the same time, she's not fully remembering the past. So for for me, when I was plotting that outer storyline of the translator's life, I was really thinking about where the emotional impulse was throughout the narrative, and using that as a sort of fulcrum for each scene of thinking about where is the emotional pulse. So I think that was where I was kind of plotting. Where's the emotional pulse here? Where's the emotional pulse here? And using that as kind of a through line. And I think that was just helpful, just like, to create some sort of like making sure that the story had like this emotional tension that was moving forward. And things are things are happening, but maybe not sometimes in like the same traditional way. I think that orbiting like worked well in thinking about it now, just like how these characters are orbiting each other and they kind of collide in ways that are unexpected.
Yeah. First, I think sometimes we don't realize things like the orbiting analogy until after the fact.
Yeah, I would,
and that's fine. But also, I mean, I think one of the, I am not like knocking, workshops or MFA programs. Please take workshops at the Writers Center. But one of the things that when you're taught the form, you are trained to look for it as well. And so sometimes I think that is a disservice for things that are maybe not even attempting to do the form that is the easiest one to teach. So I love the way the book works. Back to the chat. Why did you open the book with the death of the mother? My mother died when I was 3, and she kind of opens everything I write. And in Kidlit, so many stories open with the death of the mother, freeing them for adventure.
That's interesting to see. Yeah, I guess, because I guess in some ways, this is a character, like grief is like it's like an important aspect of the book. And it's also, grief is also how kind of reality sort of shatters and it becomes something else. It kind of opens her up to all these other possibilities. So for me, I think opening a scene with the mother, death of the mother, was really key in kind of just establishing what has happened, like what, why that second person you exists. And also it's also the mother has this kind of unusual point of view about her, how she would deal with death. Like that first opening line, she mentions she should be grateful that her mother is telling her she should be grateful for this death. So kind of just reframing I think the book is trying to reframe also that experience of death, and and she's trying to also, the main character, trying to navigate how to find a way back to herself, or what it means to come back to to your body after that experience.
I think too, you mentioned the lonely liminal aspect of the you, and I think that's such an unmooring experience right there that you have. It pairs really well with the you too. And it's like all of this is really functioning to leave us ungrounded. Sort of the opposite move of maybe the instinctual move in writing is sometimes to ground readers, but also there's some power in ungrounding them and pushing them away from the throwing them up in the sky and seeing what happens. Please keep the questions coming in the chat. So I had some questions about quotes, because there are a decent number of quotes in the novel directly attributed to real sources. And I think there might have been a few that were also fictional quotes. I Googled almost all of them, but I feel like there were a couple that maybe snuck in there that were I missed. But and I think this relates to my earlier question about having lots of little pieces in terms of things abutting. But what draws you to quotes?
I guess having quotes, it also gives, it feels like this sort of polyphonic feel, like you get to have like other voices like in the book. And also after like spending time with archives, I kind of just like love like these kind of tidbits of what people say, and just thinking about ways to kind of collecting words. Like one of the characters, as you mentioned, like kind of collects quotes. I think it's just like a way to be in conversation with other people, other artists, or other people. That felt sort of, it's interesting because you can also be in conversation with the dead almost, because like they said this and they have passed away, even if it's like a one-sided conversation. So I think that kind of, and also just, I think having all these small details just added texture to the book. and just kind of made this world more lived in some ways.
I like the texture idea. Is there anything particular that the quotes do to inform your own writing on the page? Do they push you in different directions or pull you away from certain habits?
For certain, I guess I feel like the quotes maybe I think help maybe in thinking about like what is happening thematically, or just like a kind of maybe allowed me sometimes to even introduce an idea into the narrative that might not be so obvious. So it just I felt like like, you know, like a found document you could place there and people can see it, and like it could just add this other perspective without you having to, for me to have the narrator say something too. So it kind of, and also her mother was like an archive, you know, kind of collected thing. So it kind of also felt in keeping with the characters too.
Are you a quote collector yourself? Do you have a book full of quotes somewhere?
I don't, but I probably would, I would like to. I'd like to have quotes. Aspirational.
So getting to my full geeky writer room, I really love the writing. I really enjoy reading the writing. So there's two things. I love the writing, but I also really enjoy the writing, which I think is two separate things sometimes, because sometimes I'll love writing and like, this is tough to read, but I love it. This is fun to read and I love it. So there's, let me be a geeky writer for a minute. So what is your prose philosophy? How do you approach words on the page?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Zach. Yeah, the prose philosophy, that's a little, you know, it depends. I think for the manuscript, I wanted to feel like kind of really like the language to feel very rich, almost sort of like not like decadent, but just kind of just really really visual and really visceral. So I think, and so that was like something I was sort of thinking about as I was writing, this kind of visceral quality I wanted to kind of evoke. And then in the second person section, I wanted to make sure that both the styles were a bit different, like the outer manuscript and then in the inner text, and that kind of happens because we're in different points of view. But yeah, for the second person, I think for that part, it's also just having I think for me the getting the prose right was just getting the tone right, of trying to figure out how to kind of communicate this sort of like, you know, this kind of sad, this kind of like the humor and the sadness and like in a voice. So I think it's just like for me, I guess my prose style was just kind of figuring out what the story needs, like what do I want for the story to achieve, and trying to like have the prose match a feeling or intention in that way.
How much of the prose style emerges in your first draft and like your just even rough draft versus how much is honed over the course of the revision process?
Yeah, I like, you know, the first draft, after I finished the first draft, I was like, this is an amazing blob. You know, I felt like really proud of the blob. But then like after a month, I'm like, this blob is like, just, it's not shaped. It's like really, it was really messy looking back on it. So yeah, when I look back on the first draft, it wasn't, the prose wasn't necessarily so finely tuned or anything. But I think I had a sense of the sort of kind of the emotional vector of the book. But yeah, that was a constant process of trying to do at first just really drastic changes. I changed structural things. I made big moves before really focusing on kind of like line by line, sentence by sentence, the text. So yeah, it was like just macro changes before I kind of zoomed in.
On the other hand, I think tone is one of the things can actually suffer in revision, in that we can edit the life out of our own writing. And we cut the quirks too that make it unique. And I wrote, and I'm going to add to it, we absolutely smother the amazing blob of our first draft.
The blob, yeah.
We got to save some of the blob. We got to keep it, nurture the blob, maybe make it slightly less blob-like. But yeah, how do you, is that something you're aware of when you're editing? Is that something you keep an eye out for? And like, do you ever go back and realize, oh, that was actually better before I made it right?
Yeah, no, I'm all about like saving the blob. I feel like 'cause, like that first draft has something really precious. Like it has like that initial impulse to write this book, and like I feel like it's so easy to lose that. So I was like kind of like really conscious of like of being like that blob had some initial energy and trying to like, because sometimes as you're revising you kind of lose your way. And then you have to kind of go back and remember that first draft and what you're kind of like what that energy or the intention behind it, and trying to like remember that. So yeah, that was something I was kind of, I was really, the blob was definitely a touchstone. It was, and I knew that the blob had like precious things I didn't want to lose. So even if like after some time I was like, this blob is such a, it's like, doesn't look great, but I was really trying to remember that like the feeling and like the impulse. But yeah, I think that's really important. That first draft, because you could clearly look at that first draft and just want to throw it away because it just looks like such a mess, but it really has like something really precious in it.
Great. So a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, what is your writing routine like?
Yeah, it was right. It changes for like, I think for my first book, for a short story collection, Half Gods, I was much more like, hit the page, just constantly be writing, constant, like a much more like brute force method. And now my process is not necessarily very regular. I have periods where I don't write, I have periods when I do write. So I think right now my process is much more expansive. Thinking about like, even when I'm thinking about the world, I consider that part of my writing routine. So it's not necessarily just sitting at your desk and typing away for me. It's just kind of being out in the world and kind of absorbing things. Sometimes I did write things down. It wasn't necessarily quotes, but just like little fragments of things and ideas. So yeah, so I think in my writing routine now, it's much more flexible, and sometimes but when I'm deep into a project, then I kind of probably write more regularly and get kind of and that could be like I write like a couple hours a day. But yeah, so it goes periods of kind of hibernation and then writing.
I think it's always good to hear, because the old adage, you have to write every day to be a writer, and if you talk to 50 writers, there's going to be a small number who that's actually true for in the real world. So
yeah, for sure.
Find your own writing routine, the one that makes you feel like you're a writer, and that's the right one.
That's the right one. That's exactly.
So from our own Amy Freeman, when do you bring in beta readers, assuming you do?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I guess for this book, I wrote the first draft and I had showed it to my editor. So I showed him like this really messy, like kind of like gross draft, and he was very excited about it. At the time, I was very excited about it too. Before I like look back on it, like this is a mess. So I actually for this book, I had strange beta readers. I mentioned in the beginning that my mom randomly read the book because it was there and she read it. So it wasn't necessarily very intentional. But I feel like you could bring in beta readers whenever you feel like the draft is like not in its baby form, because I feel like sometimes when you have something and it's like so fragile and like you're just starting and like you share it with somebody else, they might not be prepared, the piece might not be strong enough yet for like to like withstand like some like feedback from someone. So I think just like knowing when it's ready to share it with someone is like it's just a good thing to know, because it's really easy to stop writing something, or like, so just being kind of gentle and kind of careful with something as it's kind of moving along.
So one thing I was curious about with your writing in particular, just because I find it so interesting, is your influences. I'm curious about your literary heritage. What are the books and who are the authors you think have most influenced you?
This is, it's sometimes it's hard to say, but I think it could go from anywhere from like Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, to like Bernard Malamud, the assistant, to even like Paul Yoon. He writes a lot about thinking about like displacement also in other countries. Yeah, I feel like and also Murakami, and kind of thinking of the surreal, strange elements of his work. And also I feel like film has kind of crept in how I think about more about even structure and thinking about as I mentioned, the scenes. That's been really helpful thinking about film. But yeah.
was there any particular book or books that you felt this project in particular was in conversation with? Is this like I always feel like in some ways we write a book to respond to another book.
Oh yeah, respond to another book. Yeah, I think there are other books that have manuscript inside of it. Like I know Ruth Ozeki's book, A Tale for the Time Being, has a manuscript, like a found manuscript inside of it. It's I guess I wasn't necessarily intentionally trying to, like, there wasn't a book per se that I was speaking to, but I think I was trying to I was probably trying to be in conversation with a lot of different genres that I have read. Like Octavia Butler talks about kind of like hyper empathy. So I think I was in conversation with kind of maybe themes and ideas and other novels from like Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, to even like Stephen Millhauser's Dangerous Laughter. He has many stories in the collective We.
Yeah, I just thought of one that is, you mentioned Murakami, and now I'm thinking of Hard-Boiled Wonderland at the End of the World, which has the alternating, the sci-fi sections against the fantasy section.
Yeah.
And the fantasy sections are in a way a text within a text, not quite a text, but they function in much the same way. So that's my next essay, is comparing your book. I'm gonna have to write a whole lot now because of this chat. We're getting towards the end of the time, so if anyone has any final questions they'd like to ask, please ask them now and we'll get to them. So my next topic, and one of my absolute favorite topics to discuss when I get to talk about the idea of wonder, wondering within a book that allows itself to wonder instead of declare, maybe is the way I like to think of it. And I definitely see that in your work. How do you let yourself as a writer, as a person, be open to the big idea or the weird idea or the dangerous emotion? How do you let that have free reign in your writing?
I think I think so much of this, like, I guess so much of what's enjoyable to the writing process is that discovery aspect, and then kind of like of having questions lead you different places. And especially for this book, I couldn't really imagine where it was leading me. And kind of, I think just like following those threads without necessarily knowing where they were going to lead you. So I think there was a lot of uncertainty in this book. And like, I think even the characters even wrestle with this idea of uncertainty. So I think part of that mystery and wonder is also like knowing that these even thinking on the level of characters, you can never really know who a character is. Like, for example, we might know what a character does like 75% of the time, but there's like 25% of the time it's like they're mysterious, they're like a wonder. So kind of making sure like the characters were not necessarily, letting them have space to like be contradictory, to be a bit messy, and also not forcing the book into a strict sort of plot. Like, I didn't know where the book was going, and like that was okay. So not forcing a kind of plot onto the book or forcing it into a specific direction.
I'm thinking too, because there's certainly some cultural incentive to be decisive, to be definitive, to be declarative. But I think we don't talk enough about the virtue of uncertainty and the virtue of doubt, which is also the virtue of being open in some ways. Is that something you think you're exploring maybe a little bit too in what's going on here?
Yeah, I think 100. I think that the book is really trying to, it is kind of grappling with like so much uncertainty. Like, there's so much the characters dealing with uncertainty about like their own lives, like what's going to happen to this planet. There's so many levels of uncertainty. And it doesn't seem like even in our real lives, like, do we get definitive answers for things? We're constantly kind of dealing with this doubt and uncertainty. So that felt in some ways very kind of honest to the moment. Also, I know uncertainty could feel scary or could feel exciting, depending on how you see it. And I think that's like how the book, I was also trying to think of like uncertainty means like a lot of possibilities as well.
So there's a question from the chat. I don't think I've heard this question before, and I love it. Did any of the characters continue revealing themselves to you after you finished writing the book?
Actually, I felt like, unfortunately, no. I feel like the characters, in some ways, I feel like as I was finishing the book, I was also like personally kind of exiting the book too. Like, so in some ways, like I sometimes wonder about the characters, so like what, what happened, like, because it's also kind of there's a kind of elliptical sort of ending for me too with the novel. So I'm also curious about what happened.
When my novel came out, at one point someone asked if there was going to be a sequel, and I just remember being so absolutely stunned because that concept had never possibly never, like, why would, what, huh? I was like absolutely not ready for that question, and I guess, I mean, maybe there was potential for that and I should have looked into it, but nope.
But did you feel the urge to continue with the narrative?
I did not know. That was it.
Yeah.
That was I was like, no, I mean, by that point, I mean, also by the point time a book comes out, at least for me, it had been years and years and years before, since I had last even touched and thought about those characters. Like, I would probably be shocked if I went back and read that book, what's in it, because I don't know. Yeah, so much I've forgotten. Even when it came out, I had forgotten 90% of it. So we're getting near the end here, so I do want to move on to, if anyone else has another question in the chat, please give it, but I will move on to the final question from the Writers Center. We like to end our chat sessions with, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
I think it would be kind of going back to our earlier question about both thinking about uncertainty, of kind of being okay when you're like writing and not knowing what's going to happen, and it's really just taking one step at a time. And also that, uncertainty is also the sort of it could be exciting and full of possibilities, or it could feel stressful. So kind of just like finding a way into that space of possibilities, and also just like not being afraid to just experiment and try different things in your own writing, and just to also enjoy the process of writing itself, necessarily like the end line, just trying to get grounded in that process.
Be brave and write weird stuff when you
basically brave weird stuff. Write something really weird.
Well, Akil, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, please, if you haven't done so already, get a copy of Meet Us by the Roaring Sea. It's a marvelous novel. It's been a marvelous conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Zach. This was like, I had like such a great time, and thank you, everyone.